Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. Wow, it's been a couple of weeks since I've done a lecture, so this feels a bit weird to be back in front of the camera again. Thought I'd take a moment to talk to you this week about media and public information around emergency management situations. And I've got just this lecture this week for this particular this particular module. So this is a pretty important area of concern, as is every other one with emergency management. But I guess one of the key importances of this particular area definitely relates back to how the type of information that we release about emergencies and the roles that the different media play in this process can really impact the outcome of what happens in terms of response and recovery and so forth. So if we've got particular information going out which is incorrect, then we're likely to get responses that are incorrect. We're likely to get recoveries which are seriously delayed as a result. So we really have to be very careful about the ways that we manage media and public information in emergency environments. That's the reason I've picked this particular this picture on this slide, which is the picture of the roses in Norway, because this was a very significant event for Norway. As you would know, it was the terrorist attack that happened, I've forgotten the date, but it was a little while ago now, and I believe the person has been incarcerated for life, if I remember correctly. So in other parts of the world, when circumstances like this happen, there's often, around September 11 in 2001, there was a lot of hatred that came out around Muslim people and so forth. Whereas in this particular circumstance in Norway, they chose to demonstrate love and tell the world that we needed more love as opposed to hate, targeting a particular person. And you can clearly see the collective expression of love and support, which is demonstrated in the marches that happened in Norway. But this was not something that just flowed from the community. It's also something that came out of politicians. It came out of the media. Everything that was expressed around this event demonstrated that broader understanding of support and love, and trying to move forward in a way that didn't propagate hatred against a particular person or against a particular community. So it was a very rare way of approaching this type of event. All right. So why is media and public information important? Researchers have genuinely argued that a disaster, as we think about it, rather than a natural hazard. So a natural hazard can happen without it being a disaster, as we've talked about before, but they genuinely believe that a disaster is a result of a crisis in the communication process or a result of a communication breakdown in and around an emergency. So it's really, really important that we pay very close attention to the ways in which media and public information happens around emergencies. One of the things that we commonly get people talking about is what they call a lack of interoperability. Now, I'm going to talk about interoperability later and give you a definition, but it's often cited as a major problem for public safety because it's about how different types of responders, for instance, interact together and communicate together. So they've all got the same information and they're putting out the same message to the public in the event of an emergency. So just one example, when first responders from multiple public safety agencies arrived at Columbine High School after the shooting in 1999, interoperability problems were so great that the responders had to rely on runners to carry written messages from one agency's command centre to another because they physically didn't have the capacity to speak to each other. So they didn't have phones set up. They didn't have, two-way radio. They didn't have walkie-talkies. All of these types of things are what first responders often rely on now when they're responding to an emergency. So if we look back to this particular image that I've got here on the slide here, you would have seen this now already. These are all the different people and sectors that are involved in emergency management in Australia. So it would be, if we were to draw lines between all of these different areas in different ways, that would represent in some ways what we call interoperability. So, for instance, the port authorities, if there was some sort of event around a cruise ship, so a terrorist went onto a cruise ship and took all of the cruise passengers hostage, then the port authorities would need to speak to local government. They'd also need to speak to the Domestic Security Executive Group or something like that as well. So they're all talking to one another in order to try and respond to that circumstance, if that makes sense. So that's what we call interoperability. Public information is pretty crucial. It shapes how people prepare, how people respond, and most importantly, how many people survive often, how they recover, as well as what they know. So all of those things happen during the emergency, as well as what they know about prevention and mitigation and how they prepare beforehand in the event of an emergency. And just little things like where disaster relief is for them and so forth, so they can then go to those places in order to be given or provided with support. Public information has drawbacks and benefits. Some of the drawbacks you'll find are larger than the benefits, I would argue, but there's ways that we can manage public information so that it's more beneficial than having a whole range of drawbacks. So receiving inconsistent, incorrect or contradictory information from multiple sources can create confusion and diminish the credibility, as well as the population's overall trust in information sources and information provided. So this is absolutely vital that everyone involved in the emergency has consistent information, which is why interoperability is important. So if someone's working over here and someone's working here, they need to be able to speak together and then feed it down to a specific centralised area, and that centralised area needs to be able to get that information out to the media. So everyone is getting the same message in the media. Public information also impacts detrimentally upon individual behaviour and future warning responses, as well as other emergency management announcements or messages that are going out. So again, this is something that we need to manage very well, and something that we need to plan for down the track that we'll talk about a bit later. Most importantly, there's vulnerable communities such as poor, rural or minority communities that still can't access information due to lack of resources, including technology as a resource, due to technological failures and malfunctions, and of course the overall lack of visibility of these groups to public officials, mass media, and therefore they don't get warning messages that we're sending out. So there's some quite significant drawbacks there. We also have some really important benefits. Reliable and accurate information can save lives. So it's really important that we ensure that type of information gets out in the long run. Problems with information provision are varied. So decisions can be made on having incomplete information, so they just physically don't have all of the information around a particular emergency management incident. Lack of time and resources is something that really works against being able to gather that relevant information to support a particular decision. So people have to work together to gather that information and feed it back to the person that needs to make that decision. Sometimes information can be contradictory, as I've noted before. Incorrect information often occurs due to poor communication or misinterpreting that overall message, which we'll talk about in a moment. Use of different protocols, which might happen when multiple organisations are involved, that apply different rules or different protocols depending on what the organisation is. So they need to be able to ensure that as many organisations as possible are using similar protocols in these circumstances. Exception handling can be the cause of many mistakes because people are not familiar enough with the plans of different scenarios. So some people just may not have done the work and they may not know what they're supposed to do. And of course, work overload may also be a cause of errors. For instance, when tasks are not delegated properly or a party is not aware of the possibility of delegations. So they might make decisions without knowing that the person down from them, in fact, is the person that needs to make decisions, and so on and so forth. Interoperability is absolutely key, as you would well know by now. It's the ability of individuals from different organisations to communicate and share information. And there are significant challenges regarding communications between agencies. There's high uncertainty, particularly around sudden and unexpected events. There's risk and possible mass casualties that come out of that risk. There's increased time pressure and urgency that is put on different organisations depending on what you're looking at. There's a severe shortage of resources, and we could really see this in Hurricane Katrina particularly, where there genuinely wasn't enough food for the people to go around. There was increased there's also large-scale impact and damage, depending on what the circumstances are. So in a situation where there's an earthquake and then a subsequent tsunami, then that's something that's perhaps not as prepared for, depending on what the circumstances are. There's disruption of infrastructure support. So although there may be communication channels set up, they may not be able to communicate with each other because the infrastructure has failed. There's multiple authorities involved, and of course massive numbers of people involved at the same time. There can also be conflict of interests, where people are not supposed to be involved in certain circumstances, but they do because there's no one available. And of course, high demand for timely information. So all of these things impact the ways in which communication happens between agencies and whether or not that happens in a manner which is equitable across certain circumstances. So why is media crucial then? Media is one of the most important ways that information about a disaster is disseminated. So without the media, it's genuinely hard to get information out to people in their local communities, particularly those that are going to be affected. Media significantly influences and shapes how the population and how the government views, perceives and responds to hazards and disasters, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit. Media can also impact or drive government and community disaster policies and responses depending on what the circumstances are. And again, I'll elaborate on that in a moment. So for instance, many people now rely on the BOM, the Bureau of Meteorology, to ensure that information that they get out, to ensure the information that they have is something which is up to date and current. And they'll often visit the BOM on a regular basis when they know that a cyclone's coming, for instance. So there are drawbacks and benefits to media involved in emergency management environments. Again, the drawbacks are typically more so than the benefits, which is why we need to really manage these processes well. Research, for instance, shows that media can convey inaccurate, biased and exaggerated information, focusing on human loss and physical destruction. Again, I'll elaborate that a little bit more in a moment. It can also convey erroneous information about disasters, thus leading decision makers and public to draw the wrong conclusion about those circumstances. And therefore, they make decisions based on incorrect information, and that can lead to further destruction or further injuries and deaths amongst the public. The benefits overall, of course, it comes back to how they can play an important and positive role in communicating reliable and accurate information to the general public by disseminating warnings, providing information about affected areas to responders, and giving reassurance to victims. So all of these things can mean really great benefits when the media works well with emergency management stakeholders. However, we also have a great deal of information about how media fails specifically. And Hurricane Katrina, again, is a really good example of how this can happen. So, for instance, there were widespread rumours and myths that were fostered by the mass media in the circumstances of Katrina. They focused on extensive looting, thousands of people being dead. They talked about babies being raped in the Superdome in New Orleans, and they focused on criminal activity as being fairly well rampant. Now, we essentially got the message that was in a state of chaos and anarchy. And of course, that actually wasn't correct. That's what they focused on. They did not focus on how the community helped people to survive. They didn't focus on how the community was coming together to ensure people had food. All of those things weren't necessarily reported in the mass media. So the sense that we got was largely exaggerated. It was based on rumours and incorrect and inaccurate information. And this was in fact sometimes promulgated by elected officials. So they went out and they continued to spout and exaggerate these rumours and so forth that we were getting from the media. And of course, this was spread widely and disseminated further by the mass media in this circumstance. There is no doubt in this circumstance that the media and the way that they portrayed Hurricane Katrina and what was going on in those circumstances had a really significant impact on the public's perception and response to this disaster. So I'm just going to go now through each phase of emergency management and the types of issues that we need to think about in terms of these phases. But I'm going to do this fairly quickly overall because I'm mindful that time is marching. So in terms of prevention and mitigation, it very much relies on getting the message out to the public about the major natural hazard risks that apply to them in their local community. So although we've got these fantastic online sites that tell us about what happens and what we can do to actually minimise that natural hazard, that doesn't necessarily mean that the public is going to go to those sites, get that information and prevent those natural hazards from happening in their local communities. For instance, going around and removing trees around their houses so that bushfires may not be able to then necessarily get to the house and burn down the house, for instance. There's some research that Lindell and Perry did, and they argue that one important function of risk communication is, explicitly or implicitly, to promote appropriate protective behaviour by those to whom the information is directed. So it's about motivating the public and getting them to do something about these things before they happen. So prevention and mitigation very much relies upon getting the word out there and ensuring that the public has that information. And of course, the media can play quite a significant role in that process. It's much the same for preparedness. Preparedness literally would not be initiated or embraced by communities without public information and the media. So public information or particular narratives are created to help communities prepare for certain types of natural hazards and risks, and then the media are the ones that get that message out there. So again, for example, we've got huge amounts of material online with the Red Cross, but then I've used the metaphor, how do you lead the horse to water and then, of course, get it to drink? So the horse is the public, the water is very much the information about prevention, and then getting it to drink is getting it them to take on that information and actually do things that will help them to be more prepared. So creating those preparedness bags and so forth, putting all of their really important documents into boxes which cannot be destroyed in the event of a fire or in the event of floods. So all of these types of things are really important. Response is a little more complicated, and that's because there's it's very multi-layered and there's so many people involved. Individuals respond to warnings if they perceive a serious threat to themselves, their families, or their properties, but multiple factors can influence the way that they respond to those warnings. The credibility of the information providers, the perceived accuracy and the reliability of the warning message, the role of the government and affiliated agencies in warning processes. So if they're waiting to hear from the government, they're waiting to hear from a local prime minister or whatever it is, or the premier, to say, yes, you need to get out now, then they'll stay and they won't respond. The content of the messages and the frequencies with which the population receives the same. So if they get the same message saying it's an extreme fire danger, you need to prepare for a significant fire hazard, if they get that same message every week, then they're probably not going to respond when they hear that message from public officials on a weekend where they might have 43-degree days. And we saw this sort of emerging out of the circumstances of the Victorian bushfires, where they had significant information to tell them that they were at severe risk, extreme risk of fire danger on that weekend, but because they had heard that message so much, they really waited for those government officials to be appearing on TV and saying, get the hell out of there now. Multiple factors have been found to influence the credibility of the warning message as well. The clarity of the message, the consistency of the message. So if there's one person over here saying, no, it's okay to wait a bit, and the other person saying, get the hell out now, then they're not going to respond. Presence and respectability of officials providing the warning. So premiers and so forth, or prime ministers, presidents, etc. The accuracy of past warnings and whether or not they're questionable now. So they may have received messages in the past which haven't been accurate, and therefore they're not going to respond to these ones because, again, they don't think they're accurate. And, of course, the frequency of the hazard that's happening at that particular time. Other issues related to response definitely come back to things like the presence of a belief that amongst those that they are actually threatened and that they need to take protective action. Sometimes this message doesn't get across, and then of course if it does get across, they can significantly reduce the negative consequences of that message. Oftentimes, responders actually lack the time to search actively for information that is actually available. So again, these people are here, they're at the front line. They haven't got time to go and ask, such and such down the road in the different electorate, what's happening there and how is this happening. Like, they physically need more people to then be there and to be able to get that information. So the lack of time can really significantly impact on the way that people respond. And another issue also emerges in these circumstances too. They may not know that certain information exists and therefore not search for it. So there is evidence now of lessons learned from certain areas, emergency events, that such and such here knows this information, but this person over here doesn't know that information and therefore doesn't know how to respond accurately in that circumstance. So this person over here does not know that they need to go and get information from this person over here, if that makes sense. So one team is working in one location, is unaware of another team working nearby, and they will not search for the other team's findings or plans. That's a pretty key issue, especially when we're talking about things like fire danger and so forth. Communication breakdown is another one that really impacts what happens in response. This can also impact on recovery and so forth, and even in areas such as prevention and mitigation, as well as preparedness. So the way that one person responds to those messages online about preparedness may be completely different to how another person may respond, depending on whether or not they're from a non-English speaking background. They may not have enough money to go and buy a black box which stops their documents from being burned at a fire, all of those types of things. But communication breakdown in response is really crucial. One cause of delay is in communication procedures that involve a number of steps where errors can be made at each step. And this is absolutely vital when it comes to media in particular. So if these steps break down in the process of getting that message out, and the media are the ones that are trying to deliver that message to the people, then, we've really got a lot of issues that we need to be able to overcome. So communication requires a range of complex processes that occur simultaneously: hearing, understanding, believing, confirming, and responding. Okay? So if something breaks down in these processes, how are they going to actually get the message across? Some of the simple things that we do involve hearing, for instance. People, obviously, who are hearing impaired are not going to get the message if there's not somebody that can stand there and use Auslan to communicate to those who are hearing impaired. More importantly, we need to be able to figure out how we're going to work around those circumstances where they may not have access to a television because the power is out, for example. So it's really important to still get that message to those people who are hearing impaired, even when they can't access television and they can't see those people signing on the television for them. So government needs to have action plans in process where people go to their door and they deliver a message to those people who are hearing impaired. So it's extremely complex when we think of communication breakdown and how it happens in relation to response. Any breakdown in that process will most likely result in delayed or inaccurate responses to a weather hazard warning. And of course, as we know, that leads to people's deaths. There's a lot of discussion around social media, and I've put another couple of little videos and things up online for you to give you a little bit of background about this stuff, because it's hotly debated. But it's a really important and up-and-coming area of concern. There are some benefits, but interestingly, there seems to be more barriers at the moment if we have a look at the research around social media. The benefits: pictures and text can be shared during the early stages of a disaster to enhance situational awareness. So, for instance, it can lead to better decisions about deployment of people or aid, or we might be able to get across to those people who are hearing impaired, for example, by sharing images on social media because their phones might still be charged and so forth, right? However, there's a whole range of different barriers too. Social media are still examples of socio-technical systems, and there's so many different levels at which those socio-technical systems can break down. Their use and effectiveness can be determined by features and quality of systems and by the social context factors such as user attributes and so forth, organisational norms and technologies, and the ways in which the organisation adapts to those types of technologies. So all of these factors can mean that social media breaks down in different ways. So, for instance, the people who are running the social media program, they may not have the accurate information and therefore be putting out information which is actually incorrect. And that, of course, puts people's lives at risk. Another key issue that emerges around social media is about whether or not the information in question is generated by the public and communicated via a public commercial system, rather than by trusted information systems under organisational control. So, for example, you might have people who are tweeting away or using Facebook to post messages about particular hazards in their natural environment, and some things where it's a significant risk to people's lives, and they're giving out all of this information which is actually incorrect. So we've got a whole bunch of information over here, for instance, which is completely out of the control of those trusted information systems which are under organisation control, as opposed to these systems over here. So it might be the local council, for instance, that has a social media presence around the floods in Launceston. They had a really successful social media campaign around that, and that's under organisational control and the message can be controlled more effectively. So there's a whole range of different areas that come into play, but I'll let you listen to the videos and stuff that I've put up online around this to learn about a little bit more. So media and public information systems, as we can clearly see, are really, really important for dealing with emergencies, disasters and catastrophes and so forth. But how we use and disseminate that information, how the media interacts in this process, will always determine whether or not an emerging natural hazard becomes a disaster in those circumstances. And from what I can see, social media seems to be an area that's something to keep an eye on. It's certainly doing good when it's well controlled and so forth, and different types of campaigns have been found to be very useful, but in other areas it can lead to really difficult outcomes for a lot of people. Anyway, that's it. I hope that was helpful, and I shall chat to you all again next week. Have a great day. See ya.